традиційно, я кажу, у нас завжди чому двоє, один поганий поліцейський слідкує за часом, і щоб питання задавалися, є гарний, добрий поліцейський. В даному випадку це він.
Дякую всім, що прийшли. Це спільний захід Київської школи економіки та Центру економічної стратегії. До нашої має приєднатися Ігор Дмитренко. Тоді ми починаємо. Could you please start with some initial remarks with your vision? What we should do with the issue of budget expenditures in Ukraine, and what should be an approach based on your experience and general principles?
Я розумію, що він полегшить життя Павло, але все ж була певна послідовність.
Так. У нас буде послідовність.
Івану Миколаївичу, надали слово. Від ними ремарки. Прошу.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me say from the beginning that if we are speaking about fiscal consolidation, if we are speaking about public expenditures, this is very important to know and to recognize that it is very closely interconnected with the overall public finance reform, with the overall macroeconomic stabilization, and with structural reform. My first point is to have successful fiscal consolidation, it is necessary to reduce public expenditure. But to have not only successful short-term but sustainable fiscal consolidation, it has to be connected with other macroeconomic stabilization measures, and it has to be connected with structural reforms and institutional reforms. This maybe the most important point is that reforms have to be complex and comprehensive enough if you want to have a real success. Second point is that from short-term point of view, the more important or more urgent is macroeconomic stabilization. Macroeconomic stabilization means also fiscal consolidation, but also banking sector restructuring, monetary stability, and only if you have macroeconomic stable environment, only then it has sense to provide structural reform, because only then it will bring real and sustainable results. This is second. Third point is that, especially for the countries which are poor and lagging behind, if they want to be successful, if they want to converge to the level of rich countries, the most important strategic decision is to strengthen as much as possible economic freedom. This is very important. This is what we put also in the Way to Prosperity, the strategic material of the Ministry of Economy, which was published in July. The name is the Way to Prosperity, as you know. Maybe also National Reform Council discussed this document. And the logic on which is built this document is that necessary preconditions for high and sustainable economic growth, that means for convergence, successful convergence process, is to strengthen economic freedom as much as possible. Significant part of economic freedom is the role of government in society. Only chance, there is no alternative to this, to be successful is to reduce role of state and to focus role of state on the most important functions which state has to have in society, which means shaping a rule of games, creating rule of games, which is, and this kind of rule of games which are maximizing private initiative, investment, doing business, activity. In this regard, there are, and this is not theory, this is the practice. there are only few countries in the world which were poor and became rich. But it takes dozens of years, it takes decades. These most successful countries are Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong, South Korea, Ireland. All of these countries 50 plus years ago had less than 50% of US GDP per capita, some of them 30%, some of them even 20%. Now, all of these countries which I have mentioned have higher GDP per capita than US. Reason and the common denominator of this is that all of these countries did economic policy based on maximizing economic freedom, which means also very slim but effective state, very low public expenditures to GDP, big space for investment, for activity, for doing business, and so on and so on. Even, and this is very important because sometimes opponents are saying, that is not true, because Sweden is one of the most successful countries. Sweden is, from this point of view, not a very free country. Sweden is a socialist country. But everybody who knows history has to agree that Sweden is also evidence of this principle. Because Sweden had the most successful economic development between 1890 and 1950. During these 60 years, Sweden started, in comparison with other Western European countries, comparable Western European countries like Germany, France, Benelux, Denmark, Finland, Sweden was much poorer in the end of the 18th century. Then Sweden had economic policy based on very high economic freedom, very low redistribution. Even in the 1950, tax burden and public expenditures to GDP were in Sweden lower than in USA. During that time, Sweden, between 1890 and 1950, became the richest among this group of Western European countries, and the average year growth was multiply higher than in average in this group of countries which were considered. Then from 50 to 1990 to 90s, in Sweden grew up this redistribution, too high taxes and so on, and Sweden in this period became lagging behind of these countries. Then, in the beginning of 90s, in Sweden there were a second round of the reforms, not significantly reducing tax burden, but significantly increased economic freedom in such areas like labor market, like outsourcing of the and liberalizing many parts of the economy, like also investment in education. And from that time, from 90s, Sweden is again growing higher than Western European countries. Which means, this is, I think, very important. And this is not only because we can say, okay, Asian countries, Sweden, but also if you look at the transition countries, the most successful transition countries, like by convergence, are 5 countries: 3 Baltic countries, Poland and Slovakia. All these countries are the most successful because they base their policy on maximizing economic freedom and minimizing also redistribution and the role of state. For instance, convergence progress, average convergence progress of these 5 countries, transition countries, between 2000 and 2012 is higher than 20%. Average is 20.14% for every of these 5 countries. In every one it was higher than 20%. At the same time, in Hungary it was only 5%, in Slovenia it was only 3%. Hungary and Slovenia are countries with the highest redistribution and also the highest share of state ownership in economy and state interfering in economy. Which means there are a lot of empirical evidences about this. And from this point of view, also for Ukraine, the only way, if Ukraine wants to be successful, is to provide comprehensive, complex package of reforms based on macroeconomic stabilization, structural and institutional reforms, which will strengthen as much as possible economic freedom and reducing the role of state only for the expenditure is reducing in Ukraine, but before changes, before Maidan, your public expenditure to GDP was more than 50%, was around 52, 50%. Question is, and this is a very important question, is it possible to provide macroeconomic stabilization and to achieve together with this, at the same time, economic growth? You can see figures from Slovakia, which are real figures. And you can see on these figures that it is possible. Of course, not in 1 year, but in 3 years it is possible. You can see that we reduced public expenditure to GDP from 52.1% in 2000, which is approximately your level in 2014, and we reduced it until 2008 to 34.9%, maybe 35%, which is really, really strong decrease. Very important also is that it was done not only by reducing public expenditures, but even more it was achieved by increasing GDP, by economic growth. And decisive in this was year 2003, because in 2003 we passed a very comprehensive package of structural reforms. There were 7 or 8 bold structural reforms. During 2003 we prepared public finance reform, fiscal decentralization, tax reform, pension reform, social system reform, labor market reform, and healthcare reform. And all these reforms came into power, started functioning from January 1st, 2004. And from 2004 to 2008, we achieved really jump in economic growth. At that time, we had far highest growth in Europe, and we did really convergence jump. Which means, what is important to stress is that this is necessary to have together. There is also evidence that it is necessary to have together not only fiscal consolidation, not only cutting expenditures, but also structural reforms. How it is interconnected, for instance. It is impossible one without other. Because if you are reducing public expenditures only by cutting current structure of expenditures, which means without doing structure changes, then this reduction will be unsustainable. Maybe 1, 2 examples, and I will finish. It is not possible and not effective only to reduce expenditures, for instance, in pensions or in healthcare or in education. That is necessary to change the system of functioning. Very good example in your situation, and we had the same situation, was you have a lot of small schools which are very expensive and very ineffective. Just few children, few pupils. Costs for one children is much higher than bigger schools. It's a good idea to cancel these schools, but to organize and hire or buy buses, and then to move these children to the bigger schools in bigger villages, in which it is much higher quality and much less costly. Result is not only reducing costs, because the cost for transport by buses is much lower than difference in costs per child. Which means the result is not only saving money, we will use less money, but it will have much better result in quality of education for these children. Another example could be you have huge overcapacity in healthcare sector. We have the same. If you compare your number of beds per capita with the most developed countries, you will see that you have multiple more than this. Which means to focus on one-day surgery and one-day medical treatment, and for concentration of these capacities will bring you much less cost, because then you can save money not for heating these empty hospitals or not necessary hospitals, but for really medical treatment for the people, and so on. And this kind of social reform, which means our structural reform, which I have mentioned before, social system reform, labor market reform, pension reform, very important, fiscal decentralization, other reforms were also to not only for reducing public expenditures, but for the changing structure of these expenditures, for the reducing overspending and wasting money, and for focusing this money for real needs and for real necessary. And the last point that I wanted to stress is what I forgot to say, it is written there, I think, that the public revenues, and this is important, public revenues per GDP, as share of GDP, fell from 40% in 2000 to 32.8% in 2008, but real public revenues still rose by 75.4%, which means by 9.4% yearly in real terms. Which means you can see what is the nice in the, if you do real reforms. You have reducing public expenditures as share to GDP, but because GDP is growing very high, despite of this decrease as relative share, you have in absolute terms growth of the public money for the offering public services. And if you are doing at the same time qualitative reforms, structural reforms, then you have not only more money, but you can use this more money much more effectively. And for people, then it is visible that reforms brought real results. Results in a much better public services. It means this is the miracle of the real reforms. But let me say last remark. Problem is that there are no shortcuts in doing reforms. It doesn't mean that I have to say now, in connection with your alternative proposal of the tax reform, that if somebody thinks that the radical and liberal reform is only about tax rates, and if I'm proposing half of the rates in comparison with Ministry of Finance proposal, then it is radical and liberal, is simply not true. It is only irresponsible and populist. Because we did all these reforms. Here was also tax reform. Tax reform was prepared in 2003 and implemented from 2004. Which means, in this table, you are now in 2003, I thought. And I was finance minister at the time. I prepared this tax reform. It was fiscally almost neutral. Not fully. There was some gap. I mean, there was some reduction of the tax burden, which is also in your Ministry of Finance proposal, is 60 billion hryvnias reduction of the tax burden. This fiscal gap which is there. But it was covered. It was covered in my proposal. It was not 100% covered, but almost 100% covered. In your tax committee proposal of Mrs. Južanina, there is gap 200 billion euro, and no €1 is covered by measures for solving this. Which means finance minister is responsible not only for having good, simple, neutral, non-distortive tax system, but is responsible also for fiscal consolidation and for fiscal stability. It is his responsibility. And it is simply impossible and abnormal if there is some alternative proposal which is threatening this hardly achieved macroeconomic stabilization and which is creating 200 billion hryvnias gap without any compensation measures. And this is abnormal because if it is prepared by opposition parties, this is normal. But if it was prepared by part of coalition parties, it is abnormal. Because then it is a real threat that not that it will be not achieve the further progress what we need, what Ukraine needs. It is even a threat that what was achieved, very hardly achieved in macroeconomic stabilization during last 1 year can be lost with all necessary consequences. Which means, please, if we will speak about any reform, if we will speak about reducing public expenditures, if we will speak about any reform, it is very important to recognize difference between